Well, hello. I'm Dave McIntyre, Director of the Integrative Center for Homeland Security at Texas A&M. I want to welcome you to Bring It Home, where we take concepts of Homeland Security and national security and bring them home to you. On previous issues of Bring It Home, we've talked about issues surrounding the waging of war, and today we're going to get right to that subject, the issue of waging conventional war. The reason we're going to do this is because war is a critical life or death issue for a nation. Nations should never enter this for trivial reasons. Literally, all the resources of the nation can eventually be at risk. All the elements of national power really need to be involved when the nation wages war. Economic power, political power, informational power, and military power, of course. But you can't do that. You should not wage war sort of with one hand or one finger while you're focused on something else, because the war will spin out of control and consume you. Many nations have learned that. In fact, war is the link between national security and homeland security. Let's talk about a couple of things we've had from previous presentations in this series. Let's step back just a second to see what Clausewitz said about war. He said that it is not just a matter of violence. It's not just force. It's not just a duel. He said it's not just a matter of logic. It's not just cold, clear reasoning. And it's not just passion. All three of these things are involved. In fact, it's a synthesis of these things, and it's constantly changing. So you may enter war for what you think are cold and dispassionate reasons and find out that your people are carried away by passion. You may find that chance intervenes. You must keep these things in the background as you consider entering a war. Secondly, we've got to consider at the very beginning that wars have rules. Now, let me tell you very quickly that most people do not sit down, consider entering war and say, well, first, let me figure out what the rules are. This is not football or soccer. However, intellectually, they're playing within a certain box. What are we allowed to do? What is the justice of the war before it begins? How do we wage war justly? We don't poison medical supplies. And then how do we conduct ourselves after the war is over? And we do this so that we can minimize the times that we go to war, narrow the reasons, and wage a quicker war and have a more just and better peace at the end. That is, after all, should, after all, be the purpose of war. Lastly, we've learned that there are three traditional terms. One of these is that wars should be limited. Some wars are limited. That is, you have a specific piece of land that you're after. You have some particular injustice you want to right. Or wars may be general. That is, looking for the overthrow of the enemy. But the term total war, which many people use, actually is an improper term. That would mean using literally every resource at your asset, which is in fact illegal, and always comes back to bite those nations that try it. For one reason, if you use literally any resource and the other nation you're warring against knows they cannot trust you because you'll use any asset at your disposal, they can't even surrender. So that's the reason we don't wage total war. Here's the important point for today's lecture, and that is that in order to wage war properly, you really have to understand the context of war. And these are sort of the things that go into every war, and every war is different. You've got to think about the geography of the war. Waging war in the desert is vastly different from waging war in the jungle. Waging the war in Europe between Germany and France over relatively short distances turned out to be vastly different for the Germans than waging war in Russia over huge, enormous distances. So geography really matters. History really matters. And the history of the enemy that you're up against. The Japanese made a terrible mistake, thinking that the Russian history, Russian evaluation, and their experience with the Russians after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 would be the same sort. They could expect the same sort of thing from the Americans, who had a quite different history when the Japanese went to war with them some 40 years later. Culture, of course, matters enormously, and this is a mistake that people frequently make. Let's just take the American Army waging war on first the Indians in the eastern part of the United States and then the Indians in the western part of the United States. They had an entirely different culture. One of them was based on villages, the other based on nomadic principles, on nomadic tribes. Economics will be different. That will influence the war. International influence, where some nations have more influence internationally, are able to bring power to bear, as the Algerians did against the French. The leadership matters. Think if Robert E. Lee had been on the side of the Union at the outbreak of the Civil War. Organization and bureaucracy, the reputation of the German General Staff, for example, for efficiency. The technology matters. The technology that could not defend against Napoleon's assaults was completely changed to rifles and rifled cannon, and that technology was able to resist Napoleon's assaults a few years later when they were made by Lee, and then on the battlefield of the First World War. Technology changed warfare, as did the tank, for example, and the radio. The resources really matter. Japan really did not understand, it's clear now that their leaders did not understand the resources available to the American military if they ever decided to wage general war and not just limited war. And then finally, other players and allies. You may think that you're going to war with one country and find you're going to war with an entire group of countries. This, of course, happened between Athens and Sparta as allies began to kick in. The point here I'm trying to make is that as you begin to wage war, you have to select a political strategy, an economic strategy, and military strategy, and they all must be done within a context. We've said that strategy is the theory of cause and effect to achieve victory against a thinking enemy over time. And we've looked in previous presentations at the idea that victory is getting what you're settled for at a price you're willing to pay. It's not getting everything. And then lastly, take that idea of political strategy, economic strategy, and military strategy, and don't forget that you've got to consider your domestic audience, your people at home. You're not just making war on someone overseas, you're making war with someone at home. We're going to take these concepts and carry them on at our next presentation of Bring It Home.